Hey, and welcome to this week's Web Platform Feature of the Week. This one is not so much a single feature, but more a collection of features and also kind of a different way to think about height, width, top, right, bottom, left, all these things. And I'm going to show you, first of all, what it is. And then if you've read the newsletter, then this is also where I'm going to demonstrate to you the benefit of using um, logical properties over physical properties. So that's what we're talking about is things like top, right, bottom, left, width and height. You know this, you've probably used this a bazillion times when you've written CSS, and these are collectively known as physical properties. Now, there are other properties in CSS that kind of do the same thing with added benefits, and those are collectively called logical properties. So now if we look at a little box like this, then if we think about from the top down, we would think that this is the height of the box. And if we think about left to right, for example, we'll think about the width of the box. So if we now take these physical properties and we transfer them in our head to logical properties, then we would call this at the top our inline size, and down the bottom over here, we would call this our block size. So this would be our block size, and then at the top, it'll be our inline size. Now we'll get into why exactly that is, but if you think about this, this is your block axis and this is your inline axis, right? And same thing, if you think about, let's say, for example, adding padding to something. So if you want to add padding on this side, you would say padding left with using physical properties. If you want to add padding on this side, you would say padding right, again, using physical properties. And top and bottom. Margin, same thing. Border, same thing. Also, if you're positioning something absolutely, then you would say top so much, left so much, or top so much, right so much, bottom, and so forth. Now, with logical properties, we're substituting some of these words with inline, start, and end. So for example, instead of saying padding left, we'll say padding inline, inline start. So over here, our padding on our padding left is our padding inline start. So it's padding inline, it's on our inline axis and at the start of our inline axis. And then if we want to add padding to the right-hand side, this just becomes padding inline end on the end of our inline axis. And then of course, if we're then thinking about our top and bottom, so if we wanted to add margin at the top, for example, we would say margin block start, right? So our margin, our block axis, and at the start of our block. And of course, as you can imagine, if we wanted to add margin bottom or padding bottom or a border at the bottom, we would use margin block end. Now, the same thing for our top left. So for example, over here would be our top left. So instead of saying top and left, we would say block start and inline start, right? At the start of the block and at the start of the inline. That is going to give us the same. If we say, for example, top 0, left 0, then block start 0, inline start 0 would put us at exactly the same place. So this is essentially mentally how you can map this. And I'm using the word map deliberately because that is essentially what the browser does, is it maps these things to these physical properties internally. You don't have to think about it or worry about it. You just use your block, inline, start, end, and with that, the browser will map these things. Now, the same thing goes for width and height, as mentioned. So your height would become your block size and your width would become your inline size. Okay, so that is the basics of the theory of how this works. But what does this mean in practice and how would you use this? Because one of the things that changes is your logical property, what it means changes based on your writing mode. So whether you're left to right, right to left, or even for your vertical layouts, so your vertical writing mode, so top to bottom, even for those, the browser would map it to the logical physical property without you having to do anything. So as mentioned in the newsletter, one of the reasons people would push back oftentimes when people say, well, you never know who your users are, and maybe somebody is using your website and they're using a translation tool, and now your website falls apart or it doesn't look right or it's hard to use because you're using these physical properties, and because they're using a translation tool, it flips everything around. You're kind of losing users here because you're not catering to this right to left languages, for example. And people would often push back and say, yeah, but we just don't have the time to do that because now you would traditionally, for example, use an attribute selector where you do something like, let me type that out here real quick. So you would do something like dir equals, and then you do like right to left. And then in here, you'd have to override some of your other styles to now cater to what they should be. So maybe you had padding left, so now you would say padding right. And you'd have to make all those changes. And of course, before we have CSS nesting, you would have to, for example, do class one, and then, for your other class, you would have to do the same deal, and you'd have to do like class two, and so on and so forth. So people could say like, it's a heck of a lot of work to do all of that. It also bloats the code base and it adds a lot of additional maintenance. And because we don't really, in quotes, support these languages and writing modes, it doesn't make sense for us to do all this extra effort. The thing is, if you use these logical properties, you get this without any additional code, without any additional maintenance, without bloating your code base at all. And I'm going to show you that I'm not just making this up. The other thing also that you might be asking is, yeah, but what's the browser support? Is this like something that's coming down the pike and we can only use it in Chrome or something like that? Or it's only the very, very latest versions of the evergreen browsers? Actually, no. You'd be surprised how long a lot of these properties have already existed and been supported in all the browsers. I link to the documentation on MDN and you can go have a look, and you'll see a lot of these has actually been supported since like versions 87-ish, around there, even earlier in some cases, version 57 or around there. So it's been around for quite a long time. Now, there is a caveat, and it's that not everything where we would want logical properties, it doesn't yet exist for everything. I've also linked at the bottom of the newsletter to the work that Miriam Suzanne is doing regarding this. And if you can financially support the work she's doing, I would highly encourage you to do that, because she's essentially trying to do all the legwork, so to speak, of identifying all this stuff in this massive CSS language where we would want and need logical properties and where they don't yet exist, so that this can be documented and so that this can start then going through the conversations as part of us actually adding support for all of this to all the different browsers. We need to know where the things are missing before we can start adding them. So this is then step one. And if you can support her, again, you'll find the link to her, what is she? She's an open collective where you can then give her some money to do the work. It's a lot of work. So if you can, please do. Okay, so also there's a couple of gotchas. I'll mention two specifically. Quite a number of your shorthand properties don't yet map to the logical properties. So what do I mean by that? So for example, if you are used to, for example, let's say you're adding 0 margin to the top and bottom, but you want 2 rem to the left and right. So you might do something like this, padding 0 to rem. something like that, right? Unfortunately, this does not yet map to the logical properties. So if you do this, the zeros, top and bottom, the 2 rem, left and right, it doesn't, the browser isn't mapping that yet. So what you would do instead then, if you use logical properties, is a little bit more code. So this is one of the situations where right today, it's a little bit more code. So you do that, and that would be your 0. Whoops. And that would be a 0. Let me just get that right again. And then you do padding inline 2 rem. You would do that. So, and the same goes for margin, and there's a couple of other ones as well. So another little caveat. But now let's get into the code and let's have a look. So I have this example, 2 identical layouts. So the overall layout uses grid. That is not so important. What's important is what's happening inside of these things. So on the left-hand side, or our inline start, we have physical. So over here, we're using our physical CSS properties. And on the right, or our inline end, we're using logical properties. Right now, they both use exactly the same. So we're going to slowly but slowly change this. So if we have a look at the code, then here is the interesting part. So here's our physical card, and here's our logical card. And right now, they're identical. There's no difference. So let's see what's happening. So let's switch to right to left. You can see there's quite a few things that is now not quite what we probably wanted. And this is where you'd want to jump in, and you're going to use that attribute selector, and you're going to override things like, for example, the position absolute, the padding, and things like this. But we're not going to do that. What we're going to do is we're just going to update our logical to use logical properties. So starting down here, we can see that in our physical, we've used padding 0, 2 rem. I just set the 0, 2 rem there to show you this, but actually a div by default doesn't have any padding, so we don't really have to set the top and bottom to anything. So we're going to skip that part and just change this to inline, because that's the only thing we really want to do. Change that to 2 rem. Okay, now we set a top margin of 2 rem to our H2. So instead of saying top, we're going to say margin block start. Then our nth child even, we're giving it a margin left of -2, so we're kind of pulling it out to the left, or to our inline start. So we're changing this to margin inline start. Then you would have seen when we switched over, our little icon overlaps our text. And we definitely don't want that. We want it to be on the other side, on the inline start side. So everything stays as is, except of course we'll make our height. So we'll make that our block size. Whoops, our block size. We'll bring width up, and we'll change that to our inline size. Position, same thing. Now here we're going to use the inset property. So, and we are talking about right, or our inline end. So we're going to say inset inline end. Going to set that to 1 rem, and then we're going to get rid of this. And then we're going to say inset block. So we're talking about top, so it's our block and start. Setting that to 1 rem, and we're removing that. That is it. We have now switched from physical properties to logical properties. It's the same amount of code, but now if we switch back here, and let me refresh to make 100% sure, now what happens when we switch to right to left? Wow, look at the big difference here. This is our logical properties. We still have our even being pulled out. We've lost that over here. Our logo or icon is on the left. Our margins and everything is exactly the way we wanted it. Everything is the way we anticipated it. Also, you can see, for example, our borders are playing along nicely as well. So if we switch back to left to right, and we go back to right to left, you can already see the benefit there. Now, what if we also switch from our horizontal to a vertical? So now you can see, look at what happens over here. So here our text is coming up on the side here, but here our padding, because we're using padding inline, it's still exactly what we expected. We still have this pulled out correctly. Our margins between is everything is even. And our logo is not overlapping our text. Here it isn't either, but you will notice that the image, because it's a replaced element, it's not actually rotating. You could have a class where you could do this and then rotate it, and that's something you would have to do in both. But other than that, everything is exactly the same. You would also see here that, for example, down here, we're butting up against, because now our padding left and right is left and right. But we actually meant for it to be there and there. But because of this direction, our inline is now in this direction, and our block is in this direction. But we don't have to even really think about it. We just use the logical properties and we get this benefit out of the box. So let's switch back to our left to right. And so that is the power of using logical properties. I want to show you one more example, and that is this one over here. And so basically what's happening here is we're just using block size, or I mean, we're just setting a width and height. So you can see here we have our two boxes, box physical, box logical. One is hot pink, the one is Rebecca color purple, so you can see, and is this really what you wanted in the end, or is it more like this? Right now they're exactly the same because we're in the left to right and we're in the horizontal writing mode. But we're going to switch to a top to bottom. And here we're setting the height to 20 rem and the width to 10 rem. But here we're setting the block size to 20 rem, height, and the inline size to 10 rem, width. So let's see what happens when I now switch over. That is a big difference. And you probably wanted this more than you wanted this, because height is now still staying the logical height of top to bottom, so to speak, or vertical. But our writing mode is swapped around, right? So you'd actually expect that should also swap around now. So just like that, you've gotten that as well, without having to write any other code, without having to target any kind of attributes or anything like that. So I hope this gives you an idea of why you'd want to use logical properties, and that this is going to make you be like, oh my goodness, I can clean up my code. Instead of adding more, I can like remove maybe a bunch of my code, and I can even support more users without having to write any extra CSS. So I hope you found this interesting. I would love to hear your thoughts. Is this completely new to you? Have you known about this? If you've known about this, is there a reason why you haven't used it up to now? And now that you know, and now that you've seen the power of it, just some of it, because there's quite a lot to it if you really start digging in, for which I've provided a lot of links that you can follow. Well, one link with a lot of other links inside that link. Are you going to start using these exclusively where possible and then support Miriam so we can get it everywhere? I hope so. And I look forward to hearing your thoughts on this. And yeah, have fun, make awesome things, and keep rocking the free web. Until the next one, peace.